Welcome everyone to our talk, How Much is Enough Professional Development? Outcomes of Short and Extended Workshops on Inquiry-Based Learning in College Mathematics. I'm Tim Archie. I'm at the University of Colorado at Boulder, here presenting with Devin Daly, who is also at the University of Colorado at Boulder, and I'll hand it off to Devin to start things off.
All right, hello everyone. So we are going to be discussing two workshop models, and first want to briefly explain the general functions of the workshops. These workshops serve as professional development opportunities for undergraduate math instructors in order to increase uptake of research-based instructional strategies, including inquiry-based learning or IBL. These have been shown to improve student learning and persistence in STEM classrooms, but are currently only being utilized by a small percentage of instructors, hence the need for the workshops. So in this talk, we will be comparing two workshop models, both of which are designed to increase IBL capacity. The first workshop model are the intensive workshops. These are a 4-day-long workshop which take place over the summer, and these all have a very consistent structure with one another. The second workshop model are traveling workshops. These are shorter workshops that often take place on college campuses across the country or occasionally as part of a larger conference. They range in length, but are often less than a day and have a more variable structure. These generally serve as more of an introduction to IBL. Our prior research has shown that the intensive workshops are effective in terms of changing teaching practices. This led us to wonder if the traveling workshops could also have this impact on teaching practices. And this led us to our research question: how much is enough professional development? Or in other words, does the smaller dose a participant receives from attending a shorter traveling workshop have the same effect on teaching practices as a larger dose from the intensive summer workshops? To answer this research question, we analyzed the results of several surveys. For the intensive workshops, participants were given 3 surveys, one before the workshop, one immediately after the workshop, and a 1-year follow-up survey. Currently, around 350 participants have completed all 3 of these surveys, and that was spanning 5 years of workshops. The traveling workshops do not have a pre-survey, but do have an immediate post-survey. And we are currently in the process of collecting a follow-up survey for all of the traveling workshops, which took place between 2017 and 2020. There are common survey measures between the 2 workshop types, which enable us to compare them. The 2 that we'll be focusing on most in this talk are IBL implementation and IBL capacity, which is measured by 3 variables: participants' knowledge of IBL, skill in implementing IBL, and belief in the effectiveness of IBL as a teaching method. In terms of who the workshops are reaching, this table shows the audience of the workshops, and this is split between cases where the traveling workshops had a greater percentage of a certain group, where the 2 workshops have similar percentages, and where the intensive workshops had a greater percentage than the traveling workshops. As you can see from this table, the traveling workshops generally reached a more diverse audience in the 3 categories of career stage, institution type, and race and ethnicity. This was largely intentional and one function of having shorter workshops that take place in local areas rather than committing to traveling for an intensive 4-day summer workshop. Additionally, some of these traveling workshops were specifically targeted towards a particular audience. For instance, some were held at 2-year colleges. In general, however, you can see that between the 2 types of workshops, a really broad range of faculty have been reached. So with that, I will hand things over to Tim to discuss the research findings.
Thanks, Devin. Both the intensive workshops and traveling workshops were designed to increase participants' capacity to use IBL teaching methods. As you can see on this chart, both intensive and traveling workshop participants reported stronger beliefs about the effectiveness of IBL, gains in skill in using IBL methods, and increased knowledge of IBL methods. We use slightly different measures and scales for measuring capacity, so it's not appropriate for us to compare across workshop types or doses in terms of gains. However, it is important to note that the relative gains in capacity belief, skill, and knowledge are the same for both dosages. We see the lowest gains in beliefs about the effectiveness of IBL. This makes sense given that workshop participants self-select to participate, and thus many of the participants already believe that IBL is effective. We see higher gains in IBL knowledge than skill, which also makes sense as skills take more time to develop the knowledge. Bottom line here is that both workshops seem to be improving participants' capacity to use IBL methods in a consistent way. Next slide, please. Okay, here's another look at capacity, but this time we're looking at average scores over time with the interpretation of these average scores on the left vertical axis. The interpretation for belief in the effectiveness of IBL is in parentheses. Capacity measures for intensive workshops are colored in orange, and we have pre-workshop, post-workshop, and follow-up averages for each capacity measure. We have follow-up capacity measures for traveling workshops and are shown on the end there in blue. This was the only time we collected measures of capacity for the traveling workshops where we used identical measures to the intensive workshops. Now, a couple of points here. For the intensive workshops, we see statistically significant gains in all three capacity measures from pre to post, and that these gains are sustained at follow-up, meaning the effects of the workshops hold over time. While we don't have pre or post data for the traveling workshops, we can see that on average, traveling workshop participants reported similar levels of IBL capacity at follow-up. It is a little surprising to see that despite the smaller dose, traveling workshops seem to build IBL capacity as well as the intensive workshops. So we'll definitely keep an eye on this as we collect more data to see if this finding stays the same or not. Similar to the previous slide I showed you, the pattern of scores across workshops and time points are stable. Belief in the effectiveness of IBL ranks highest, followed by IBL knowledge, then IBL skill. This makes sense given that knowledge is easier to acquire than skill, and because participants are self-selecting to participate in workshops. Many of them already believe that IBL is effective. So overall, we have some good evidence here that both workshop types are effective in increasing IBL capacity. But what we also wanted to know is, did this increasing capacity, translate into actually using or changing the way people use their teaching to incorporate more IBL teaching methods? Next slide, please. So looking at implementation, we see that a very large proportion of participants from both workshops are implementing IBL methods to some degree. Next slide. However, when we drill down to see to get more detail about their implementation, we see that participants who got the smaller dose, the traveling workshops, are not implementing as intensively as the intensive workshop participants. Most traveling workshop participants only implemented some methods, where most intensive workshop participants were implementing one or more full IBL courses. This is not surprising given the smaller dosage of the traveling workshops and the time allocated at the intensive workshops for participants to work on their own IBL course. Next slide, please. We also asked participants about their frequency of use of a variety of teaching methods, both IBL teaching methods such as student group work, student presentation, but also we asked them about non-IBL methods such as lecture and instructor problem solving. And based on these reported frequencies, we then created an IBL intensity scale shown on the vertical axis. Lower scores represent less intensive use of IBL methods, and higher scores represent more intensive use of IBL methods. We measured IBL intensity at pre-workshop and at follow-up time points for the intensive workshops. And again, we only measured follow-up for the traveling workshops. So you'll see we didn't measure the pre for the traveling workshops on the chart there. We see statistically significant differences in pre to follow-up average IBL intensity for the intensive workshops, which seems to indicate that the intensive workshops are effective in changing teaching practice. As for the traveling workshops, we assume that the average pre-IBL intensity scores, if we had collected this data, would be close to or lower than the intensive workshops. But we do know that the average IBL intensity at follow-up is significantly lower for traveling workshops compared to intensive workshops, which makes sense given the smaller dose. Next slide, please. Overall, both workshop dosages were effective in increasing IBL capacity. However, we see greater implementation of IBL methods for the intensive workshop participants than the traveling workshops. This makes sense given that the intensive workshops use a consistent structure, they are longer, and they allow participants time to plan their own IBL course. Intensive workshop participants are committing to 4 days. So by doing that, they're showing that they have a high level of commitment to implementing IBL to begin with. So that's not surprising there. Traveling workshops reached a different subset of the teaching population and required less commitment as they were typically only several hours long and they didn't have to go anywhere. It seems that the smaller dosage was enough to increase capacity and interest in IBL and served as a jumping off point, as we do see a substantial number of traveling workshop participants implementing or at least experimenting IBL. So if you remember, traveling workshop participants were implementing some methods, but not typically a whole class worth or multiple class worth of IBL methods. Next slide, please. And so while the dosage metaphor seems to work in this case, perhaps a more appropriate way to describe the purpose and outcomes of the two workshops is having different tools for different jobs. Screwdriver is good for turning screws and a wrench for bolts. You can use them, you can't really use them interchangeably and expect good results. Intensive workshops are good for people who are ready to commit to using IBL, and traveling workshops are good for those who want to get their feet wet. But our data shows that both tools are effective in building IBL capacity. Next slide, please. And so wrapping up, on the research side of things, we still have some more data collection to do. And we're also going to rerun these analyses when we get that data in. But also, given the variability in the traveling workshops, we will look for differences in outcomes like capacity and implementation based on the subsets of traveling workshops. So there's many different formats, sizes. We want to make sure that our data is either A, representative of all of those different workshop types, or if we're just getting a subset of that and maybe looking at differences just because there was so much variability in those traveling workshops. Also, this past year, intensive workshops were delivered for the first time in an online format, and the preliminary data from these workshops indicate that the online format produces similar outcomes to face-to-face intensive workshops. So there'll be some more development and refining of an online intensive workshop model. So that's all we have for today, but if you would like to, or if you're interested in following up with us, our email addresses are below and we can take some questions now. Thank you.